Hi everyone and welcome back to Maverick Games. It's Dwayne here. Today we're going to dive in and we're going to make a level 1 ranger with the new D&D 2024 rules. Let's start off with a basic portrait. Right here we have a ranger, clearly an elven range, but we'll get to that in a little bit. First thing we're going to do is specify that he is a level 1 ranger. We're going to be making a level 1 character. His name is Sindril Farleaf. He's a ranger. I've already gone ahead and actually created his stats. Now you're going to notice that I don't actually have ability scores. What I've done instead is I'm going to try just listing the modifiers. After going through the handbook and in actual recent years, it becomes apparent that the ability scores themselves aren't so much as important as the modifiers. And it seems, at least at my tables, it causes a lot of confusion with my players. They're constantly juggling between their scores and their modifiers, and they don't really know the difference between the two. So I thought in this example, we'll try and make the actual ability scores redundant and just focus on the modifiers. You'll see here that he has a +1 strength, +2 dexterity, +1 constitution, does not have a modifier on intelligence. He has a +2 wisdom and a +1 charisma. To finish things off with this step before we move on, he is a lawful neutral character. One of the things that I really like about the 2024 Player's Handbook is they've gone a step further when it comes to defining the player's 6 attributes. Not only just using numbers, but throwing in adjectives to sort of give the players a better sense of what this character might look like in the real world. So, for example, if you go to page 39 of the Player's Handbook, they'll break down each attribute. You can choose either a high or a low descriptor, whether or not you're in the positives or negatives when it comes to your attributes. And the adjective kind of fits with sort of what that character might look like to an outside person who isn't sitting around guessing what their modifiers are. Let me give you an example. So, Sindril has a strength that is defined as muscular. His dexterity, he is a very poised individual. For constitution, he could be classed as very hardy. Living in the wilderness probably does that. On his intelligence side, he is considered a cautious individual. As far as his wisdom goes, he would be classed as wary. And lastly, for charisma, he would be considered an inspiring individual. This little adjective system is actually really cool, and I encourage you actually to try it out with your players just to give them a better sense of what their character's attributes mean when translated into the real world. So on page 40 of the Player's Handbook, just like the attributes, they offer up a different way to describe your character's alignment rather than using the in-game terms. It's a nice little chart, and get your players to have a look at it and see if they can find something that fits. It's also a great way to describe NPCs and other characters in the game besides the players. In this case, my character is going to be methodical. It's a different way of describing lawful neutral and fits the bill. Now we're going to move on to class features. Now, the Ranger at first level gets several class features, and one of them is going to be a little bit different than what you're used to seeing. And we're going to touch on that in a second, but for now, we're going to list them down here. So as a level 1 Ranger, you have the ability to cast spells. Time in the Wilderness, attuning to nature, it gives them a little bit of a magical ability. Not much, say compared to a wizard or a druid, but just enough to help them out. Favored enemy is also something that gets carried over in 2024, but that one that I was talking about that's different is weapon mastery. Now let's go over class features. Starting with spell casting, as a first level ranger, you're going to get 2 first level spell slots as well as the ability to prepare 2 first level spells. Now, I've chosen Cure Wounds and Ensnaring Strike. You can choose any spells that you want, however. These are just simply the recommended ones. So let's talk about favored enemy for a second. This is a big departure from the 5e rules. In this case, favored enemy bestows the Hunter's Mark spell ability on the ranger. So in this case, the ranger always has the Hunter's Mark spell prepared. It doesn't actually count towards his prepared spell list. You can cast it twice without expending a spell slot, and you regain all uses after a long rest. Now, this is different in that it is a constantly prepared spell and it doesn't count against your total, but it still is a spell nonetheless. So we're going to refer to the Hunter's Mark spell, which is listed elsewhere in the Player's Handbook. The Hunter's Mark spell is basically this. As a bonus action, you can magically mark one creature you can see within range as your quarry. Until the spell ends, you deal an extra 1d6 force damage to the target whenever you hit with an attack roll. You also have an advantage on any perception or survival check you make to find it. Now, if the target drops to 0 hit points before the spell ends, you can take a bonus action to move the mark to a new creature you can see within range. Because this is now a spell and not just a baked-in ability, you have to be careful of your action economy. It does use a bonus action. So with everything going on, you want to make sure that your players are aware that their action economy is going to take a hit if they choose to use Hunter's Mark. I think this is a great change, and it adds a little bit more concisiveness to it, rather than just leaving it an open-ended, picking a specific creature that you may or may not run into during your Dungeon Master's campaign. So here's the one that everyone wanted to know about, Weapon Mastery. Weapon Mastery is a new trait, or a new feature for 2024, and I am super excited about it. It gives the martial classes a little bit of extra oomph when it comes to actual combat. It gives it a little bit more flavor as well. Now, as a ranger, you get 2 weapon masteries. Your training with weapons allows you to use the mastery properties of 2 kinds of weapons you are proficient with. Whenever you finish a long rest, you can change the kind of weapons you choose. Basically, this reflects your constant training and practicing with your weapons. It's kind of neat that you can toss it up, almost like preparing spells in a way. You can choose which weapons you think you're going to be using the most during that day of adventuring and switch it out. Now, keeping in mind that Weapon Mastery has different traits depending on the weapon that you choose to master. And those traits can be found in the equipment list alongside the keywords like finesse and light, etc. Make sure you have a look and see which Weapon Mastery traits are going to be best suited for your character. We're going to close out this step of character creation with assigning our hit points and listing our proficiencies. Now, each Dungeon Master might do it a little bit differently, but in my campaigns, I like to assign maximum hit points for first level. This gives the players a fighting chance out of the gate. In this case, I have a +1 for my constitution, and a D10 is the hit dice for rangers, so that gives me 11 hit points. Now, all characters get a +2 proficiency bonus, regardless of what class they choose. So we're going to list that here, and like before, I'm going to have some proficiencies that I can choose from, as well as some that are assigned to me. I'm going to list these here as well. Now, the system that I'm most excited for in the 2024 D&D is Origins. Origins is essentially just a pulling forward of your backgrounds and some of the aspects of character creation that players tend to leave to the end. They're now bringing it forward and bundling it up with some other systems like attribute increases that you would normally have with your race, which is now species, but just other things and blending it all into one sort of cohesive step. For this character, I'm going to choose Guide as my background. Now, the Guide is essentially an outdoorsman. You came of age outdoors, far from the settled lands. Your home was anywhere you chose to spread your bedroll. There are wonders in this wilderness, strange monsters, pristine forests and streams, overgrown ruins of great halls once trod by giants, and you learned to fend for yourself as you explored them. From time to time, you guided friendly nature priests who instructed you in the fundamentals of channeling the magic of the wild. Now, your background, or origin, is encompassing many different things, but first and foremost, when you choose your background, you're going to get a feat. Now, feats were kind of reserved for later on in the character progress and evolution, but in the new D&D, you get to pick a feat based on what your background is, or you get assigned a feat based on what your background is. So in this particular one, they've assigned me the Magic Initiate. So you gain the following benefits: 2 cantrips, so added to any other spells that you might already have. You pull them from the Cleric, Druid, or Wizard spell list. And also Intelligence, Wisdom, and Charisma is going to be your spellcasting ability for it. Now you also get a level 1 spell from the same list that you selected for this feat's cantrip. You always have that spell prepared. So you can cast it once without a spell slot, and you regain the ability to cast it in that way again after a long rest. But you can always use one of your available spell slots to cast it whenever you want. Now the cool thing about this is that you can change that spell every time that you go up a level. So again, much like preparing spells in other classes, you can trade it off almost kind of like your mastery as well. Now, you can take this feat more than once, but you have to choose a different spell each time. You can't double up and stack the spell. So this is the step 1 of Origin, which is picking your background. Now, as opposed to getting your attribute increases tied to your species, or formerly race, in the new Origin system, your attribute increases are actually tied to your background. So in this case, you're going to get 3 different attributes, and these attributes are going to be relevant to the background that you choose. You're then going to get a choice on which ones you want to increase and how you want to increase your attributes. You can raise one of those attributes by 2 and another one by 1, or you can raise all 3 by 1. Now, it's worth noting that these are the actual attribute scores and not the modifiers. Now, of course, you're going to get some proficiencies as well, and in this case, I'm taking Stealth and I'm taking Survival. In this case, tool proficiencies are handled a little bit differently. They are tied to your specific background, But tools themselves actually get a little bit of shot in the arm in 2024 and actually have some very specific uses. So in this case, my tool proficiency is cartographer. So I have a proficiency in using that tool, and when we get around to the equipment section, you'll also see that I start with a set of cartographer tools. Now, there is a cost attached to these tools, not the actual proficiency, but more importantly, they actually have a specific skill that you can actually use now. In this case, it's called utilize, which is the keyword, and I can draft a map of a small area with a difficulty of 15. Now, the end result is I end up with a map. So crafting now is an actual thing in the game. So a map, according to the adventuring gear, is if you consult an accurate map, you gain a +5 bonus to wisdom survival checks you make to find your way in a place represented on it. This is a really neat thing for Dungeon Masters because now it gives players a narrative hook and a reason to use these tools. So finally, we arrive at your species selection. So this part of the origin process is more than just simply picking a race and moving on with a couple attribute bonuses and special abilities. There's a little bit more decision making involved. Now, obviously, if you saw the character portrait, you know that we're going to be playing an elf. So the creature type for this elf is humanoid, with a medium size and a speed of 30 feet. You'll see why it's 35 in a second. Now, along with each species, you're going to get some traits. In this case, dark vision, elven lineage, which I'll explain in a second, and that aforementioned bonus in speed. So I have a +5 speed, and it's already reflected in that line above. I get the Druidcraft cantrip as a wood elf. I get Fey Ancestry, Keen Senses, and Trance. Fey Ancestry gives you advantage on saving throws that you can make to avoid or end the charm condition. Keen Senses, on the other hand, lets you have proficiency in Insight, Perception, or Survival, again adding to the already existing list of proficiencies that you have. Trance is you don't need to sleep, and magic can't put you to sleep. And just like the last version of the game, basically, it cuts down on the amount of time you have to spend doing a long rest, as long as you're in a trance-like meditation. Before we move on to the next step, let's bring it all together. I've redesigned a sheet to allow for saving throws and added an armor class section, which we'll get to in a second, as well as a new proficiency icon. All of this should be very concise and easy to read, and we're now on to the last step, which is picking equipment. Now, one of the things that I've really hated about all versions of D&D, and it really did start with 5th edition, was equipment bloat. What I mean by that is that when a player creates his character, he's given so much stuff, meaning he's given things that he might not even know what to do with, but they're given to him, usually in the form of an adventuring pack or an explorer pack. Now, I come from a time when playing D&D meant you actually had to buy all your starting equipment. There was no options to get swords, armor, shields, etc. You had to actually go and talk to a vendor and actually purchase these items with the gold that you were allotted at the very beginning of the game. Now, I do like the idea of starting out with some equipment, but I do love the idea of not having enough equipment to hit the road right away. In this case, the new edition of D&D gives you a choice, just like the 5th edition, where you're going to have gold in hand or a set of starting equipment. But the nice thing about this is that the starting equipment is relatively small compared to the past edition. In fact, you're not even going to get all the weapons that you might want. So, you get a little bit of gold to start out with, you're going to have to hit those shops and buy some of the equipment the old-fashioned way. In this case, we're going to take option A, as presented in the guide background, which allows me to have a short bow with 20 arrows, the aforementioned cartographer tools, a bedroll, a quiver to put those 20 arrows in, a tent, some traveling clothes, and 3 gold pieces. Gone are the explorer's pack and all the different packs that just overwhelm the player with all this stuff that in most cases they don't even use. So I think it's great, and it's a neat little narrative way to get players back into the town and shopping with some of the vendors. Thanks for tuning in to my 2024 Ranger build. I hope you're all having fun playing Dungeons & Dragons, especially the new edition. We'll talk to you soon. Before you go, I need your help. I'm trying to grow the exposure of what we do here at Maverick Games. My goal is to actually bring information to parents and students for fun, academics, and even support of neurodivergency. Please subscribe and make sure you click on those notifications. I don't do paid ads or sponsorships. I hope that you can find content here that's enjoyable for yourself and maybe others. Thank you very much, and thanks for tuning in.